Hi, I'm Ted Piccone, a senior fellow with the Foreign Policy Program, and I'm here with my colleagues, and we're here to talk about Venezuela.
I'm Samantha Gross. I'm a fellow in Foreign Policy in the Energy Security and Climate Program.
I'm Dany Bahar. I'm a fellow at the Global Economy and Development Program here at Brookings, and I follow closely the Venezuelan crisis.
So we're sitting together with a lot that is happening on the ground in Venezuela. Is changing by the hour, but we know some very basic facts on the ground, which is that a referendum for a constituent assembly was held on Sunday, highly contested with low turnout and increasingly contested claims about how many votes were actually cast. This is just the latest but most dramatic step, I think, in an unfolding crisis that has been taking place in Venezuela for years now, going back, I would say, to the election of Hugo Chavez in late 1990s. So the question now is, exactly what is happening and what could happen in the next coming days. How did we get here? Like, how did Venezuela, which used to be one of the better performers in Latin America, both economically and politically, get to this state of affairs? What are the elements of the economic crisis? And in particular, because Venezuela is such an important oil-producing country, what are the oil dynamics and all of this? What happens next, and what should be done by external actors? So those are some of the key questions. On the political side of the crisis, if you look back to when Hugo Chavez was elected, he made it very clear what his plan was. And he proceeded on a strategy to rewrite Venezuela's constitution that would favor the poor, that would favor his constituency, which happened to be the majority of Venezuelans. And he continued to win elections through mostly free and fair procedures. And there was this veneer of democratic legitimacy for many of those years. But nonetheless, the Constitution was written in a way that allowed him over time to seize control of the various institutions. That included the court system, the military, the electoral tribunal, and the National Assembly. At various stages, he went back to the voters and received support. However, there were some key turning points, and most importantly, when the opposition won control of the National Assembly. And that was roughly...
That was in December 2015.
And so they took office in January 2016.
Yeah, it was a landslide victory. The opposition won about 2/3 of the seats in the House, unexpectedly, which that will give them a lot of power. In theory, that would have given them a lot of power to change things and to change the institutions and to renew them.
And the current president, Nicolas Maduro, who succeeded Hugo Chavez after he died, very quickly acted to nullify and to block everything that the opposition-controlled National Assembly tried to do. So at that point, you had a confrontation between these two parts of the recognized political system. Then what happened?
Yeah, well, so I think that was a big, the moment you're describing was a big turn into the institutional crisis that we have today, because the outgoing assembly, which was, it had a majority of government people, before they left office, they renamed all the justices in the Supreme Court with their own people. So when the new assembly came, every decision that the new assembly, which was in the hands of the opposition, which about 14 million Venezuelans voted in that election, they really couldn't do a lot. Every decision they made was nullified by the Supreme Court and so on. And then this happened in the midst of a huge economic crisis, which has become really a humanitarian crisis. And I think Samantha will talk a little bit about that. But when the moment Venezuela, during the years in which Chavez was in government, they experienced a booming consumption. And really the number of, the poverty in Venezuela decreased. But when you actually look at the numbers, this reduction in poverty was fully driven by an increase in consumption. So Chavez, and then for a little time Maduro later, they enjoyed from the largest and longest oil boom in the history of the country. But they used all the money that started flowing in. Oil is more than 95% of Venezuelan exports. They used all the money that started flowing in to for social programs and so on, but they didn't really use it for infrastructure or investment or production. Not only that, they also increased the external debt of Venezuela by a factor of 5 or 6. So just to give you an idea, in the mid-2000s, Venezuela could have paid all of its external debt in 4 to 5 months of exports. Today, they need more than 5 or 6 years. So they borrowed a lot of money. So that at the moment that when the price of oil dropped in 2014, Venezuela was highly indebted, and they didn't really have any more resources to keep covering their fiscal expenditure, and nobody else wanted to lend money to Venezuela because they were not going to pay back. They're highly indebted. So they got into a crisis in which there was no more money flowing in, and they had to cut imports. A lot of the consumption that was happening in all these years was based on imports. Venezuelan productive sector is very weak after many years of regulations and nationalization, price controls. So they were relying on imports, and today Venezuela is importing about 70% less than they were importing 4 or 5 years ago. So that's why you see there's no food, there's no medicines, right. There are no basic goods.
And what else has happened in terms of inflation and the currency issues?
Right, so inflation has also gone through the roof. It's basically an hyperinflation. We don't have the real numbers because the government hasn't really shown the real numbers, but the estimates are that inflation is between 700 to 1,000% a year, which is hyperinflation basically. I think it's the only country in the world nowadays that has those numbers. And this happens is a very simple, for an economist, it's a very simple explanation. They had a huge fiscal deficit. They were spending much more than they were getting through taxes, and they started printing money.
Right.
So then that leads you immediately into hyperinflation. So now you have an economy which is completely unfunctional. There are no resources. There's hyperinflation, and then you have price controls that are still in place. So you have scarcity. You have huge black markets. Which only the people in the middle upper class can buy actually food. So the same people that they were trying to protect all these years are the same people that now are really suffering because they have no access to food, no access to medicines at the prices that the market should be establishing.
Right, infant mortality has gone up, maternal mortality is going up. So Samantha, say a bit about the oil economy and put it in the global context. Like, where does Venezuela sit in the oil market globally? And then specifically, the particular qualities of the Venezuelan oil industry.
So I would add, sort of building on what Dany said, in late 2014 and early 2015 when you saw the oil price drop so much, it was kind of a double whammy for the Venezuelan economy. The oil made up 95% of Venezuelan exports, so it was really their only source of hard currency.
Of GDP is the oil?
It's the GDP percent, I don't know, do you?
Well, the thing is that we don't really know how to measure GDP in Venezuela today because there are like 3 or 4 exchange rates. So the estimates, some people say it's about $100 billion a year. I don't know exactly. So it depends. I don't have the exact figure here, but of course it's very high. But the main source of income when you look at an export is definitely oil.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. As far as bringing in hard currency that they can use to buy goods and services, which you're seeing less of made in Venezuela these days. But there was a double whammy in late 2014 to early 2015 because not only was the oil price cut in half during that period, and it stayed that low and is expected to stay that low for some time. You also, during the boom that Dany talked about, you didn't see a lot of investment in the Venezuelan oil industry. So not only did they suffer this price crash when it happened, they also had, to some sense, not been feeding the goose that was laying the golden eggs. And so there's a real lack of infrastructure in the oil industry as well. They haven't kept up the refineries, they haven't kept up the oil infrastructure. And so you're seeing, production's actually been declining in addition to what you're seeing with the drop in oil price. And so
and dramatically so. Yeah. I think that at the best time Venezuela was exporting 3 million barrels per day. Now some sources say it's even less than 2.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing as well.
So it's a huge drop. And PDVSA, which is the state-owned oil company, which at the time in the 90s or even at the 80s, it was like a first world company.
Absolutely.
Today it's completely mismanaged. It has lost a lot of its technical capacity, and it has been. I think I saw some numbers that the payroll in PDVSA increased by a factor of 3 or 4 because they've been also hiring a lot of people to do social programs, and there's a lot of corruption in there too.
Yeah,
and another complicating factor.
Around the world.
That's right, there are, and complicating factor is the quality of the crude that comes out of Venezuela.
Absolutely, Venezuela most of Venezuela's crude is a very, very heavy variety, and it's quite difficult to refine. And so there's a couple different ways that can be done. There are certain refineries around the world that can do that crude, particularly the U.S. Gulf Coast. There's also some in China and India that are also large consumers of Venezuelan crude, but the U.S. is about a third of their market. The other thing that they can do is import lighter crude to mix with that heavy crude to make it a blend that's more palatable to more refineries around the world. And a lot of that diluent that they use to lighten up their heavy crude is imported from the United States, particularly since we lifted our export ban recently, a couple years ago.
So the U.S. has potentially a lot of leverage in this situation, but it has chosen a very incremental approach. After the happened over the weekend, the election, there was an immediate announcement of sanctions against President Maduro. Before that, there were other rounds of sanctions that were targeted against the vice president and other members of the Supreme Court who tried to block the operations of the National Assembly. What might happen next, both in Venezuela and by the external actors? I mean, my own sense is that they are heading for a true train wreck, a complete collapse of Venezuelan democracy. They've crossed the line completely. So number one, they're completely out of step with the norms of the hemisphere, and the Organization of American States has responded, but not as fully as a group. The hemisphere is divided because Venezuela has very effectively bought off a lot of the states in the Caribbean, which represent a lot of votes in the OAS, and as well as a couple of other states. So they still have some allies. How long will that last? Immediately, regional states have come out against the vote on Sunday and do not recognize its legitimacy. So you might now be able to actually fashion a coalition that could exert pressure on the Maduro regime that we haven't seen before. And so if the U.S. is able to marshal that kind of coalition, you might be able to increase the level of discomfort and pain for the Venezuelan regime. Is it enough to actually split it so that the constituencies that are supporting Maduro, particularly the military, will be able to break off from Maduro and say, look, we can no longer keep the country safe with you in power. We need to now withdraw our support. That to me seems to me the most critical next step. So I want to get your thoughts on what might happen internally and what role the international community can play at this point.
Well, I think today and this week we're really full of uncertainty. What we have seen and what the evidence has shown, and we should talk about this a little bit maybe, is that Maduro and his inner circle, they're willing to do anything to stay in power. In the past 3 months, more than 100 days, more than 3 months, there have been protests on the streets almost on a daily basis, and they have been repressed violently by the National Guard. There are huge, there are numerous accusations of human rights violations and so on. So these people seem to really be willing to do anything to stay in power. So then the question is, what is going to really make them change their mind? So as you said, I think that there's a diplomatic front, which so far hasn't really worked that well, but maybe there's space there. There are two other aspects that I think are on the table in terms of the U.S. administration. One of them is the sanctions that have been put in place and that could be even broadened, that maybe could play a role. We can talk about that a little bit. And the other one is the financial default in the country. I think that Venezuela, as I said before, they have to really service the debt in huge amounts. They have the international reserves in the country have gone down dramatically. So they're really running out of cash. So you have to imagine a situation in which you really have expenses, you just run out of cash. So something's got to give. So far, what they've been doing is to cut imports. So people are starving, but there's so much they can cut anymore. So I think that on the financial, if they will have a default, which I think is imminent, it's going to happen at some point this year or next year, that's also going to put a lot of pressure in them. But that's more in the longer term.
Yeah. So Samantha, is there anything in the oil markets that you think would play a role here? And I'm thinking in particular about China, whether China would be willing to step in yet again and either extend the terms of the loan or do something else in the way the arrangement works.
There are a number of things that could happen with respect to oil. I mean, even if the U.S. cut off imports from Venezuela, which there has been some talk of the U.S. doing, China has some ability to take in some of that oil, so that would soften the blow a bit of the U.S. embargo on Venezuelan oil. China also has some investments in the Venezuelan oil industry, and so there is some chance that they could invest further in the Venezuelan oil industry and pump some cash into the economy that way. So there are a number of options. Even the U.S. is a very large consumer of Venezuelan oil, but we don't hold all the levers. There are a number of things that could happen there.
So an incremental next step would be perhaps to cut off our export of oil products to Venezuela that help them refine into a lighter crude. That's one option, but they could probably buy those products somewhere else.
They could. There would be some displacement costs, and it would take a bit of time to set that up. But it would certainly send a signal. The next step of that would be to eliminate Venezuelan imports to the U.S., which would be a more difficult signal. It would be much more difficult for Venezuela to place their crude, because there are only so many places where that crude can be refined.
But would that hurt American consumers at the gas pump?
To some extent, not nearly as much as it would hurt Venezuela, but the crude that is run in those U.S. Gulf Coast refineries could be replaced. It would take some doing. It would likely not be as well suited to those refineries and would involve some costs, which I think U.S. consumers would then see at the pump.
And we have our own reserves. Would we potentially dip into those?
I don't think we would need to go there. There's quite a loose crude oil market right now, and plenty of oil on the market. I don't think it would be an emergency that would rise to that level.
Right.
But you would probably see a little bit of impact to the pump here in the U.S.
So I know we're running out of time. I think as a kind of final thought, we're facing an unprecedented crisis in this country that is very close to the United States. We're likely to see not only humanitarian disaster getting worse in Venezuela, but increasing number of refugees crossing borders into Brazil, into Colombia, and heading north. This probably requires more than the OES or Mercosur or UNASUR interventions. It requires UN role to step up. So a lot more in the toolbox that hasn't quite yet been used, but it seems to me very clear we've now crossed that point where there needs to be a whole nother ramped up effort to kind of save Venezuela from becoming a truly failed state.
Yeah. So I think that's an unfortunate scenario that could happen. I think it's also interesting to mention just for a couple of minutes these pros and cons of the idea of a total embargo, because I think we need to be careful that if that will be a direction that the U.S. government will go to, it would really have a disastrous impact on the Venezuelan people. It will increase the humanitarian crisis, as you said, to levels that we haven't seen before. And then the question is if that's going to be effective at all. I don't think we know. But I also, it seems like the government of Maduro and his people, they really closed all other options. They could have solved this crisis months ago or years ago. And so if this happened, I think that it should be clear that they brought upon themselves. That's very unfortunate.
Yeah, it would definitely hasten an endgame that I don't think anybody really wants to see.
But at the end of the day, in my view, given where we are in the world geopolitically, that Venezuela has not yet risen to the level of, say, what happened with Iran and trying to prevent nuclear weapons there. So it's ultimately a question of the Venezuelan people trying to figure this out, and of course with some kind of external support. But let's hope they can figure their way through this.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, thank you.